Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species is considered to be his magnum opus. But how confident was Darwin in his book? And why did Darwin put off on publishing a 300,000 word follow-up to The Origin of Species, which he believed and he claimed would alleviate all doubts and concerns? Let's find out. Hey everyone, welcome back to SAFT Podcast. And today we have a really exciting topic that we're going to dive in. This has been something that I've been wanting to bring to you, and I'm so glad that we can make it happen. We're going to look and dive deep into what really went about with Darwin's work in The Origin of Species. This is going to be fascinating, so hold on to your seats. And I am super delighted to have with us Dr. Robert F. Shedinger joining us. Professor, welcome to SAFT Podcast, and we're so delighted to have you here.
Delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Let me give you a very quick introduction to Professor, and we will dive right in. We've got a lot of content to fit in within 60 minutes, so we've got no time to lose. He is a professor of religion at Luther College, and he had also been the co-chair of the Nobel Peace Prize Forum in 2011. His research areas focus on the Syriac versional tradition of the New Testament, theoretical approaches to the study of religion, Christianity and its intersection and its interactions with Islam, and also science and religion, which is going to be the focus of today's talk. His books include Jesus and Jihad, Reclaiming the Prophetic Heart of Christianity and Islam, Was Jesus a Muslim? Questioning Categories in the Study of Religion, and the book that we're going to discuss about, Darwin's Bluff, the mystery of the book Darwin Never Finished. Now, when I came across this book, I was really taken aback. Was there a book that Darwin didn't finish? Was there a book that Darwin did not put out? There would be no way that we would not hear about it, especially given how famous his first book was. So your book is diving into Darwin's life. Your book is looking into Darwin's life, is one extra book about Darwin. Now, given that we already have a plethora of work that expounds and dives into Darwin's life and legacy, what makes your book stand out, Professor?
Yeah, so I think what the unique thing about my book is that it's based on my own comprehensive reading of Darwin's correspondence, at least up through the year 1863. The publication of his correspondence by Cambridge University Press is now over 33 volumes. I read the first 11 volumes, which is about 4,000 pages worth in detail, in comprehensive, just because I was curious, and I didn't know I was going to write a book about it. I was just curious to understand Darwin from his own perspective. And so what my book does is it sort of tells Darwin's story in his own words, rather than me as author speaking for him, as I think so many other books about Darwin do. And I think when you do that, you get a very different picture of Darwin. Most books are written from the perspective of knowing how famous Darwin would become because of his work on the origin of species and other things. And they would know how his life was going to turn out, and that colors how they tell the story. But with Darwin's correspondence, when he was writing to Joseph, botanist friend in 1850, a letter, he didn't even know that 9 years later he would publish The Origin of Species, let alone become one of the most famous scientists in the world. It just told us what he. And so the correspondence gives us kind of a real-time view of how Darwin thought at different periods in his life. And I don't think any other book on Darwin delves into the correspondence as comprehensively as my book does.
And when you say correspondence, you're talking about close to 15,000 letters that Darwin had written to his close friends, acquaintances, and the others. Am I correct?
Correct, yeah. Letters written by Darwin to those people, but also letters written to Darwin by his scientific associates, friends, family members. So the correspondence includes both Darwin's letters that he wrote, but also letters written to him, which can be just as illuminating.
Yeah, and in a day and age where letter writing is almost non-existent, it may look a bit odd to dive into one person's letters, but given that era, letters played a key role in drawing out what they didn't say out in published work. And So you said this started off as a casual reading. And at what stage did you feel like you wanted to make this into a book? Was it some conversation that you had with someone, or did you find something striking in those letters?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think it was when I came across, when we got to 1859, the letters that Darwin sent out to his correspondents, his scientific associates, with complimentary copies of The Origin of Species. In every single one, he told them to read The Origin as nothing more than an abstract of his theory, not the full theory. It didn't contain all the evidence. It didn't contain references to authorities. There were almost no footnotes, as just an abstract and not as his magnum. So that's what really got me interested to think that maybe there's a book in here somewhere.
Right. Now, the title of your book is pretty aggressive, Darwin's Bluff, because he has this larger-than-life image that is held very dearly among those who cherish evolution to be the theory of everything, evolution to be the final nail in the coffin as they see it on the question of God, creation, the Bible, and so on and so forth. So some may be inclined to look at your book and rule it out as sort of like a last-ditch creationist, anti-science, anti-evolution effort to disparage this great scientist who is out there. So what is your real objective with the book? Is that along posited?
No, not at all. My purpose for writing the book was to try to recruit human Darwin. I have a lot of respect for and a lot of interest in Darwin, a lot of appreciation for aspects of Darwin. This is not meant to, undermine him in any way, but simply to try to tell a more truthful story about who he was and how he understood the work that he was doing. A story that has been lost as he's become this mythological figure as the founder of modern evolutionary theory. He's taken on all this mythological baggage. And reading the correspondence, I realized that a lot of that was mythology, and I just simply wanted to recover a true human Darwin. Who was he really?
Now, the title of the book reads Darwin's Bluff. Now, when you phrase it that way, are you saying that Darwin, in deceptive or concealing way, he tried to pull the wool over the eyes of whoever came across his work? Or are you positing that what eventually came out to be, given what happened with The Origin of Species and then the book that Darwin didn't publish, which we will get to right after this, given how all of that things transpired, it looks like this could be called Darwin's Bluff. Like, what is the reason you gave that specific phrasing for the book?
The title comes, really from the way bluff is used in, say, playing cards, where you pretend that you have a good hand when in fact maybe you really don't, and you try to bluff your opponents to fold so that you win the hand even though you don't have the good cards. And so his constant repetition that he had more evidence for his theory than was in The Origin of Species, because it was only an abstract, that he had that evidence and that he was going to present it within 2 to 3 years, and then never did, and constantly made excuses for why he didn't. It was kind of like a card player kind of bluffing their way through the hand.
Wow. So that means, this may be shocking for many to hear that The Origin of Species, which again has this larger-than-life image to that book as well. It's not merely seen as a scientific work. For some, it is seen as the holy grail of science. For some, it is seen as their own holy Bible of sort, an alternative to the Bible itself. Now, are you saying that in The Origin of Species, Darwin didn't really present the evidences to back up his theory? Or was it that he had some, but he kept saying that larger evidences are in the works?
Well, what he does in The Origin of Species, he lays out his theory in outline. He does not present much evidence, particularly for natural selection. And you don't only have to take that from me. The great Harvard zoologist Ernst Mayr, who was one of the biggest supporters of Charles Darwin and Darwinian evolution throughout the 20th century, even he once wrote that Darwin produced embarrassingly little evidence for the major aspects of his theory, including natural selection. So this has been recognized, that the origin of species lays out in outline form a theory, but doesn't really provide a lot of evidence to prove that that's what's actually happening in nature. In several places in the Origin, Darwin indicates that he had long catalogs of facts that could prove the theoretical positions he was stating, but that he couldn't include them in the Origin because the Origin was just an abstract, but that he would include them later in a longer work that he would follow up within 2 to 3 years.
Wow. And as an economics, I wouldn't go as much to say an economics researcher, even though I've done research in economics and published work. For us, abstract is very specific. It's easily under 150 words, something of that sort, very minimal. But Darwin's abstract, The Origin of Species, is a big work. It's almost as the equivalent of a proper paper in today's academic terms. Now, that's fascinating. That's fascinating to me. Is that because that was how abstracts were back in the day, or was that something that Darwin deliberately did?
I'm not aware of any other works that were that long that authors considered a mere abstract. So I think this is kind of unique to Darwin. But he was adamant about it. I mean, he told everybody that he could possibly tell, my book is only an abstract. And even when reviews started coming out in the British press after The Origin of Species was published, people were giving him the benefit of the doubt. The review saying, now Darwin tells us this is only an abstract, so we must withhold final judgment on what we think of his theory until we see the evidence that he promises will come in a longer work, which this is just an abstract. And so people took him at his word that it was an abstract and waited for the bigger book that would bring the evidence in that was not in the abstract, but they waited forever and the big book never appeared.
Right. And now that's going to be the key one that we're going to, the meaty part of the conversation as to why did that book never come out. But before we get into that, I had two questions that I want to talk about with regard to The Origin of Species. Now, this is an abstract. It didn't have the evidential element to it that it should have possessed given what Darwin was proposing. So why did Darwin go ahead and publish this? Was this sort of like a hurried effort to trademark the idea? What really happened there?
Okay, so what happened there was, in my view, Darwin was forced into publishing again, pretty much against his will. So he had been collecting, well, he says he had been collecting facts related to species for, over 20 years, and had sort of developed a framework for his theory, which he had written, kind of a sketch of in 1842, and then he wrote about 100-page enhancement of that in 1844, but he had no intention of publishing it because he knew it didn't have the evidence that would convince skeptical readers. So he was waiting to publish until he got more evidence. And so he put off and he put off and he put off. And it was finally Charles Lyell, the great geologist who Darwin was very close friends with, who finally told Darwin, look, you got to publish something on species, on your theory. Get it out there to get priority, because otherwise somebody else is going to come along and publish something, and you're not going to get the credit. And that actually did happen in the summer of 1858. Alfred Russel Wallace, a British naturalist who was in Southeast Asia, who had some correspondence with Darwin, sent a paper to Darwin that he wrote that was basically an outline of Darwin's theory of natural selection. And Darwin realized that Lyell's prediction was coming true, that he was going to be usurped if Wallace's paper was published. And so Lyell and Joseph Dalton Hooker got together, since Darwin was their friend, and they went to the Linnaean Society and said, we want to have this paper by Wallace read along with a brief abstract by Darwin, written by of Darwin's theory, read before the Linnaean Society. So people would see, well, both of them sort of came up with the same idea. And then while Wallace was still immersed in Southeast Asia, they encouraged Darwin to go ahead and publish something longer, a book length work that would get out, and then he would sort of get all of natural selection. So I think it was the arrival of Wallace's paper and the idea that he was going to be usurped that kind of forced him into abstracting the big book, which he had been working on, abstracted in the form of the Origin, and then promised to follow up with the big book, which would contain all the evidence. Had Wallace's paper not arrived, I think Darwin may never have actually published The Origin of Species. He had every excuse in the book not to publish, but he was kind of forced into it by Lyell and by the arrival of Wallace's paper.
Oh, I know that right now, hearing this or reading this from your book, some of our hardcore anti-evolutionist friends would be cursing Wallace's for sending through that, for sending through his abstract that was the domino effect towards Darwin publishing this. But that's really really fascinating. And I know this may take us a bit off tangent, but what really came about with Wallace's own work? Did that see light further, or was that then overshadowed by Darwin's work?
Yeah, well, he was overshadowed by Darwin, and he didn't seem to care about that. Priority didn't seem to really matter much to Wallace. His article was published, and he went on, and when he came back from Southeast Asia, he published a number of other books of his own. I think the most important one is the last work that he published, called The World of Life, in which he really does make an argument for intelligent design, despite the fact that he believed natural selection could do certain things, that he didn't believe natural selection could account for the full diversity of life, and particularly the emergence of mind and consciousness into the universe. And so his book, The World of Life, I think is a better read than The Origin of Species. If people are looking for something to read Wallace. He was the real naturalist. Okay, Darwin was an amateur. He was sort of playing at this. Wallace was the real deal. Okay, he spent 8 years immersed in the jungles of Southeast Asia, getting bouts of malaria and surviving them, and living with the indigenous populations there. Something Darwin never really did, and I think he was the real naturalist of the two.
Yeah. And before we move into the natural selection bit, in your engagement with Darwin's correspondence, you are able to draw out very clearly why you think, as you said right now, that Darwin was an amateur at this. Now, a more fuller treatment is there in the book, but to someone who would want to get wet their appetite, why do you think Darwin was an amateur? I mean, you're talking this about someone who's seen as one of the most prominent scientists in human history. So it can be seen as a pretty damning claim. But what in Darwin's correspondence showed you that he was an amateur of sort?
Okay. Well, I mean, first of all, my students are always shocked when I teach this in my science and religion class. They assume that Darwin must have been a professor at a major British university, with a degree in natural history or biology or something. And they're shocked when they learn that, he had no degree in this. He just had the basic bachelor's degree from Cambridge in preparation for ministry, which he never went into, but that's where his father had sent him. He never held a paying job. He lived on family money and inheritance. And so he was just kind of an upper-class British gentleman who had all the time in the world to just sort of dabble in whatever he wanted to do. But he didn't hold a position in a university professor. He didn't teach. He really was an amateur in that sense. And you can see some of this in his correspondence, particularly in some of his work on botany. So he had become interested in plants that had different forms of flowers that would form on the same plant. And so he wanted to collect examples from the field. But and one of the plants that he got very interested in is a plant that's popularly known as purple loosestrife. And it grows in very dense webs, almost like a weed. And it's hard to distinguish single plants from one another because of the dense web, the way in which they grow. Darwin made excuses because of his health that he couldn't go out in the field and collect these samples. So he sent untrained teenagers, he sent his children out into the field to collect the samples for him. His niece went out, and 19 years old, she had no background in biology or botany or anything. And she went out and tried to collect samples for him and wrote back to him and said, we find it very difficult to tell which are different plants. And so, he was just sending untrained teenagers out to do field work for him, and he couldn't really know whether what he was getting back were really distinct plants, which really undermined the value of the work that he was doing. And even a reviewer of one of his books on botany, on plants, said that it seems like most of the examples he gave came from plants in his own garden. And his work would be much better if it was based on plants that he had collected in nature. But Darwin wouldn't go out into the field and collect because he made the excuse that his health was too bad. So he used amateurs to do a lot of field work for him, which I think underscores the amateurish nature of.
Yeah. I think the point that we're clearly drawing out is not that because Darwin did not have a formal training, everything in evolution or everything in the origin of species is wrong. That is not the point being drawn out. It's the fact that his lack of training to engage with proper scientific methodology undercuts the evidence and the case that he makes. Yeah. Now, when I came across this point that you were making about Darwin's amateur nature, the lack of formal training, it was quite timely because I've been engaging in casual conversation with a prominent atheist speaker from India, and he is very hyper pro-evolution, and he has been taunting me to get into a debate about evolution with him, and he's been trying to taunt everyone to get into a debate with evolution about him. And seeing that I was not going to fall for his trap, he started taking a jab at my intellect, and he was like, oh, this is a topic only for people who have gone to schools and colleges can engage with. I assume you don't have basic training. And when I came across your point about Darwin himself being an amateur, I couldn't help but hold in a chuckle. But anyway, you mentioned about the point about natural selection. Now, natural selection is seen as one of the most momentous contribution that Darwin made towards the whole field of scientific enterprise as well. We see this come about even when the talk is about the fine-tuning of the universe. There is this underlying point about how nature could have selected for its own these cosmic fine-tuning arrangements that the universe, the cosmic with the capital C, could have made those selections and arrangements so that life eventually came about, exists and all of that. And this is also a key tenet of Darwinian macroevolution. But how did Darwin come up with this idea about natural selection? And what was the fundamental flaw that he had when he came about the idea about natural selection?
Yeah, so Darwin very early on, before he got into thinking about species and evolution, was really interested in geology. When he was on the voyage of the Beagle, he was mostly looking for evidence that would support the geological theory of Charles Lyell, who had developed this idea of uniformitarianism. That is, that the Earth's geological features result from long-term processes that are occurring in the world today. Erosion, wind and water erosion, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, things like that. This was against what was called the catastrophic view of like a global flood or major catastrophes that shaped the Earth. Lyell said, no, the Earth is shaped simply by mundane processes that we see going on around us today, acting over long spans of time. And Darwin was really taken with that theory, that geological theory, and that became the foundation for his work in evolution. So what he was looking for was some mechanism acting in the world today that we can see actually occurring that would have the ability to create organic change over time. And the only thing he could come up with was artificial selection, selection done by animal and plant breeders. He spent a lot of time talking to animal and plant breeders and seeing how they could create different forms of plants and animals over time through artificial selection, them selecting in each generation, which dogs to breed, which dogs to breed to create the sort of the end goal of what they wanted to create, a hunting dog or a dog for security or whatever it is, or a sheep herding dog. And so that's really where Darwin came up with the idea of natural selection. He said nature does the selecting in the same way that artificial selectors do the selecting. The problem, of course, is apparent that artificial selection is goal-directed. Duration, the people are selecting which animals to breed or which plants to breed toward the creation of a future goal that they have in mind. Natural selection isn't goal-directed in terms of the way Darwin thought of it. And so artificial selection becomes a very poor analogy for natural selection, and yet it was the main theme of The Origin of Species. Darwin held to it throughout his entire life, that natural selection was just artificial selection writ large, and he never came to terms with the idea that artificial selection is goal-directed while natural selection is not. The analogy doesn't work, and I think undermines his whole theory.
Now, that seems to be quite obvious for anyone to make out. I mean, even today, if one were to use, let's say, an example or an analogy from a purely undirected case of Darwin evolution, for instance, to then force fit it into a case making for intelligent design, the evolutionists would immediately raise his flag and say, you can't do that. One is undirected, the other is directed. You can't force fit one case into the other. You can't force fit evidence from one category to the other. So it is quite obvious. Now, okay, we understand that Darwin did not pick up on that. Darwin didn't see the inherent flaw in his reasoning. But did any of his contemporaries pick up on that? Did at least those who agreed with him or championed his idea find out and point out this flaw?
Well, yeah, I mean, many of the early criticisms of Darwin's theory did point out this flaw. Even Wallace criticized the analogy. Other people criticized the analogy. People recognized that it just was not a good analogy. Even Bishop Wilberforce, in his 14,000-word review of the Origin in the Quarterly Review, pointed out that this is a poor analogy. So it was pretty obvious to people that the analogy didn't work. But Darwin didn't have anything else. Because he was so wedded to trying to create a parallel between his view of evolution and Lyell's uniformitarian geology, he had to find something occurring in the world today with the power to create organic change. And the only thing he could come up with was artificial selection. So he had no other choice.
Now I am a true amateur when it comes to geology. So Lyell's view of that Unitarian outlook in geology, is that now held as a part of geological understanding, or was that subplaced and replaced by something else?
The understanding of geology being geological features of the Earth having, the Earth having been shaped geologically by sort of mundane processes happening over long spans of time, I think is still pretty much the view today.
Right.
I mean, he didn't understand things like plate tectonics and how that kind of thing worked. But again, that would fit within his uniformitarian worldview.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. Now we come to the key part. It's taken us 30 minutes to reach here, but we are here. So we've seen the lack of evidence and the lack of evidence basically in the Origin of Species. the poor reasoning that Darwin had when he came up with the idea about natural selection, and the hurried nature that he had in putting out the origin of species, the preemptive bail of sort that he kept on taking when he kept referencing this to be just an abstract and the bigger work was coming. So the origin of species had made quite a bit of an impact. It had sent shockwaves in the pond. A lot of stuff were happening, and there's a lot of anticipation for his big book that he was promising everyone. And he had written, I think, around 300,000 words for that big book, but that never came out. Now, it is said that it was because Darwin was unwell, he had illness, and he was not able to finish it, and therefore not able to publish it. And so the image that comes up is Darwin does the origin of species. He then focuses purely to work on this big book that he wants to put out, gets 300,000 words in, is unable to finish it, and he unfortunately passes away. You think that that is not actually what happened. That is not the reality of the picture. So why did Darwin not publish the highly anticipated follow-up to the origin of species?
Okay, so a couple things here, and first of all, let's just remember a couple things here. So the theory is that Darwin didn't finish, and I mean the work before he published The Origin of Species, the big book was already 3/4 complete. So he only had to finish 25% of it, and he said he would do that within 2 to 3 years and publish it. So it shouldn't have been that onerous of a task. Now, he never did. We'll get to why he didn't in a minute. But the theory that he didn't because of his illness is really kind of ridiculous. Because let's just remember, after publishing The Origin of Species in 1859, Darwin then published an entire new monograph on orchids. He published actually an expanded version of the first 2 chapters of the big book on variation of animals and plants under domestication, which was a 2-volume work, which was about 300,000 words. And that was basically a new work. He then published the 300,000 word Descent of Man and on sexual and the Descent of Man and other things. And then he published a book on earthworms. So if Darwin didn't have the physical stamina to finish a work that was already 3/4 complete, then where did he get the physical stamina to publish all these new works that he published after The Origin, which themselves would have been 600,000, 700,000, 800,000 words worth of work? So that whole idea that it was because of his illness is just ridiculous. Darwin was very industrious after publishing The Origin. Okay, so that's the first point. The big book manuscript, what was left of it, survived among his papers and was published by Cambridge University Press in 1975. Scholars have spent very little time talking about it or looking at it. But I was able to just get a used copy off of Amazon.com. I mean, it was no problem getting a hold of it. I didn't have to go to Cambridge to read the actual manuscript. It's widely available. And so I got the incomplete big book manuscript and read it and compared it to The Origin. And what I noticed was that all of the long catalogs of facts and evidence that he said would be in that big book simply wasn't there. The big book, had he published it, would not have answered the criticisms that he was getting from The Origin. And I think he recognized that. And that's why he delayed, and then turned to other projects and never published it. Never wanted to come out and say that, sorry, I really don't have the evidence for natural selection. Just kept making excuses. Well, I got involved in this other work. Oh, my health isn't very good. People were still writing to him in the 1870s saying, when are we going to see that big book? The anticipation of it, Darwin created tremendous anticipation for it. And people were writing to him saying, we really want to see that. We really want to see that. And he kept making excuse after excuse after excuse and never did complete it and never did publish it. And I think it's because he knew that it would not answer his critics. He really tried to pull a bait and switch. The Orchid book, which he published 3 years after The Origin, he thought that book might actually do the trick of convincing people of the power of natural selection to produce all of these intricate different orchid flowers that are sort of constructed in ways to ensure their cross-fertilization by insects. But people ended up reading the Orchid book, which is a fascinating book, as an example of natural theology rather than natural selection. So I think his strategy kind of failed, kind of blew up in his face.
Now, when Darwin's big book was put out by Cambridge, as you said, in 1975, afterwards Stephen Jay Gould came out and said that Darwin didn't even have to work on this. His first book sufficed. What is that sort of like a cover-up attempt to conceal any sort of shame that would befall Darwin's legacy? Why would an experienced and learned scientist like him would make such a remark?
Yeah, I know he made that remark in his review of the big book when it came out in 75. And all I can say is what he's ignoring is all of the letters that people were writing to Darwin saying, we need to see the big book. Okay. So the origin did not suffice. It did not, people were intrigued by the origin, but they wanted to see the evidence. And so they were writing to him and saying, when are you going to finish this big book? You talked about 2 to 3 years. When is it going to come out? We're waiting for it. And in Darwin's Bluff, all the letters are there. We're writing to Darwin in great anticipation of the big book. So in their minds, the origin did not suffice. Maybe it did in Stephen Jay Gould's mind, but it certainly didn't in the minds of Darwin's original readers. And so I think Gould is just trying to apologize for why Darwin never finished and published the big book. In his own time, people did want to see that big book. They were really anticipating it.
Yeah, and the attitude of Darwin's contemporaries, when one explores what that was, when one explores how the intellectual atmosphere at that time was towards Darwin's work, one debate that immediately comes up, and you yourself have referenced the names in this podcast as well, the debate between Wilberforce and Huxley, Darwin's Bulldog, Huxley shredding Wilberforce to pieces because Wilberforce had no real understanding of evolution. And that caricature has been carried forward in the years after. Whenever an evolutionist gets into a debate or a heated dialogue with someone who disagrees with evolution, the person who disagrees with evolution is seen as the descendant of the ignorant Wilberforce who had no idea about what Darwin's work was actually about. Is that a fair representation of what happened or how Wilberforce engaged with it? And also the way Huxley defended Darwin's work. Is he sort of like a fair representation of how the academic atmosphere was at that time when Darwin's work came out?
No, I don't think so at all. I think there's a lot of myths surrounding that whole exchange at the British Association meeting in the summer of 1859, or 1860, I guess it would have been. Huxley's support for Darwin had much less to do with his belief that Darwin had proven this theory than it did with the way in which Darwin went about trying to answer the question. Huxley liked Darwin's work simply because Darwin was trying to find a naturalistic explanation for evolution, for the diversity of life. And that supported Huxley's own agnostic ideas. He coined the term agnostic. And his own sort of antipathy to ecclesiastical authority. So Huxley was very much an anti-church or anti-ecclesiastical person. And so that's why he liked Darwin's work. But he didn't believe that Darwin had actually proven his theory. He said until artificial selection, until breeders, plant and animal breeders, are able to create a new species through artificial selection, Darwin's theory will remain just an unproven hypothesis. And as far as I know, we're still at over 100 years later, artificial selection has not created a new species. We got all kinds of breeds of dogs, but they're all part of the same species. So Huxley was not really gung-ho about Darwin's theory in terms of it proving how evolution occurred. He just liked the method that Darwin used, the naturalistic method. In terms of the Wilberforce debate, again, previously, the idea, Wilberforce is made out to be just kind of a clown in the way that this is often told, and Huxley just, cut him to pieces and all of this. But Wilberforce wrote a 14,000-word review of The Origin of Species in the Quarterly Review. And if you read that, many of his criticisms of The Origin of Species are very scientifically well informed. And would still be current today. So Wilberforce was much better versed in Darwin's theory than the sort of mythology would lead us to believe.
Wow. I mean, hearing that about Huxley itself would be eye-opening to many, given that Huxley's strong criticism of Darwin still remains as an active challenge to Darwin in macroevolutionary theory. Now, as we come to the final bits of this extremely fascinating conversation and insightful dialogue, when this book is out there in the open, and especially when this dialogue is also out there in the open, the immediate response that would come about to this conversation would be is that, okay, fine, Darwin didn't have that confidence in his work, Darwin didn't know everything, but that's in the past. We have all the plethora of evidence out there. We have all the scientific advancement that's done on evolution. And evolution is a fact. Evolution is no longer a theory or a hypothesis. Evolution is a proper fact. And that would be a quick response that would come about directly to your book and to any conversation that carries forward what you present in your book. But as someone who has looked in depth at what Darwin felt and how his contemporaries felt, and the whole arena of the dialogue that happens on the topic of evolution as such, what would be, as an author, your remark would look like to a retort of that sort?
Yeah. So first of all, I think somebody who would make that claim would be misunderstanding the purpose of the book. The book is not about evolutionary theory. It's about Darwin as a person and as a scientist. And so it should be evaluated on that grounds. My previous book, The Mystery of Evolutionary Mechanisms, deals more with modern evolutionary theory. But the Darwin's Bluff is about Darwin. It's not really about evolution. So that would be number one. But number two, I think it's important because of the mythological status that Darwin has as being, at the foundation of modern evolutionary theory, recognizing the flaws in Darwin's work and his own lack of confidence in his theory, for than modern evolutionary theory. And one of the big questions, there are many, and we don't have time to go into all of them, but one of the big ones is Darwin well knew in his own time that the fossil record did not support his theory. He was well aware that of the concept that we call today the Cambrian explosion, the rather sudden appearance, geologically speaking, in the Cambrian era, 520 or 30 million years ago, of all these new complex animal body plans without a long period of slow, gradual evolution leading up to them. Now, we know a lot more about that today than Darwin did, but Darwin was aware of that. They had found fossils from that time period in Darwin's day of the sudden appearance of these various animal body plans without slow, gradual evolution leading up to it. That Darwin said if the fossils that would sort of prove his theory were never found, that fact alone would undermine his whole theory of natural selection and slow, gradual evolutionary change. But he hoped that it was just simply the fact of the incompleteness of the fossil record, and that in the future, geologists and paleontologists would find the fossils that were missing that would absolve him. Unfortunately for him, the problem's only gotten worse. It's sort of the trade secret of paleontology that very few paleontologists want to talk about, other than someone like Gunter Beckley, who will talk about it.
Yeah.
That the trade secret is that most species come into the fossil record fully formed without clear antecedents, exist for a while, and then go extinct. And the Cambrian explosion has only gotten more problematic for Darwin as we found more and more fossils. And Precambrian fossils, we can't find the long stages of evolution leading up to that sudden appearance of animal body plans. So I think that's, Darwin knew that was a problem for his theory, and modern evolutionary theory has not solved that. The problem's only gotten worse.
Yeah, indeed. And Gunter Beckley and the work that Discovery Institute and similar others do in this area is quite remarkable. And I would say Discovery Institute stands apart with regards to the scholarly pedigree that they put forward in engaging specifically with the question of the evolutionary theory. Now, as we come to the last few minutes of this podcast, now you've laid clear the objective of your book. You are looking into Darwin as a common man. He has this, like as I mentioned, this larger than life image. He's seen as this untouched holy figure of atheism to many. But your book definitely has got repercussions for the whole scientific enterprise as it stands today. As you remark right now, as we saw with what Stephen Jay Gould told about the big book, do you see, apart from getting the reader to engage with who Darwin was as a man and exploring Darwin's own internal conflicts with the work that he did and so on and so forth, other than that, do you see a specific area where your book could drive conversation, where your book could be a catalyst for further scientific inquiry?
Well, I think what I would say to that is simply that if people read Darwin's Bluff and they come to recognize that Darwin, or they come to see the real Darwin, except based on how he presents himself in his correspondence, that he really was very insecure in terms of his theory and not having the evidence for it. I think that should lead people to then question, then why is he viewed in this mythological way in modern science in the way in which he is? Why can't modern scientists just accept Darwin as he was with all of his flaws? What drives that mythologizing of Darwin? Is that itself evidence of lack of security in the biological establishment over the theory of evolution? Any strong evolutionist will tell you, oh, we've got it all figured out. We're just dealing with some of the details, but we know everything happened by natural selection, random genetic drift and things like that. But the fact that they have to create secure in their theory as they would like us to believe that they are.
Yeah.
So I think that can drive some conversations about, okay, well, then what are some of the problems with modern evolutionary theory? Cambrian explosion is one, but there are many others.
Yeah, I think even though as humble as you would want to present the impact of your book, then this is going to be a Shedinger explosion as the book reaches much more hands, as they come to terms with what Darwin himself thought about his theory and the lesser-known myth, the lesser-known myth buster this book is going to turn out to be. And I think this clearly lays out one universal fact in that we humans have got our own flaws with the way we reason, be it Darwin when he comes about with natural selection, or be it the case of confirmation bias that someone may have when they put forward an idea or defend a concept. It's often placed against the Christian and theist, saying that, oh, you are shackled by religion, you are shackled by the establishment, that you have this confirmation bias to somehow make your ideology stay true. But the way we see with Darwin and how the whole scientific enterprise so far has covered up for Darwin's Bluff shows that it is the aspect of the fallen nature of mankind as a whole. So I believe that also would lay out a bridge for further conversation as we come to terms with the inherent errors and failures human reasoning has in itself. Definitely the book is the better place for you to dive in and explore what we have unpacked. We have just given you an outline, and I hope this spurs you on to get hold a copy of Darwin's Bluff and engage with it, and also utilize it as you study more into evolutionary theory as such, knowing who Darwin was. There's a lot about Darwin's personal life that we haven't touched upon. The personal motivators that drove him to get into the theory and so on and so forth. But that is getting its best treatment in the book itself. So I hope you will grab a copy of it. And thank you, Professor, for taking your time out of your schedule and being here with us and sharing the wonderful insights of your monumental work.
Thank you for the opportunity to share my work. It's a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you everyone for joining in, and I hope we will catch you in the next one. Until then, take care and God bless.